Oh, hey. Yo ho, hello there. All right, confirmation. Audio's coming through, video's coming through. All right. Well, you lucky people. Those of you that aren't doing something normal, sane, and healthy, like vacationing right now, congratulations. I'm here. I'm here for you. Not for me. Not because I want attention. No. Because you need something like this to happen. To keep you satisfied. So, let's get back to this book. This wonderful book. Planet X with the X-Men and the Star Treks. And we are on chapter 5. I don't know how long this one is going to go. I think 90 minutes yesterday was all right. I don't know if I can do more than that, but hey, we're going to see how healthy it is for me to continue doing this today, and then how many more days it'll take over the course of the next week, because I don't think this is going to go as fast as I thought I was going to. I thought this dumb book was going to be a lot faster of a read. Anyways, chapter 5. As Troy accompanied Security Chief Clark along one of the starbase's curving corridors, she used her betazoid senses to locate Wolverine and probe the mutant's state of mind. What she found in him was anger and frustration in equal parts. The anger was primitive, instinctual, what an animal might have felt at being caged. The frustration came from the restraint he had to exercise, lest he compound his offense by attempting to tear up his cell. I don't mind telling you, said Clark, he had quite a bit of damage. Oh, he did, quite a bit of damage. Troy let her empathic contact with Wolverine lapse. Oh, she replied. 2 tables, several chairs, and a replicator, the security officer enumerated. And, of course, one of the bulkheads. The counselor looked at her. One of the bulkheads. Clark nodded. Counselor nodded. I see. He's just up ahead, said Clark. She turned to her guest. You're sure you can handle this? Troy nodded. If the prisoner acts up, I'll just use a few Mokbara moves on him. The chief looked at her. You're joking, right? The counselor didn't sense any real amusement on Clark's part. Trying to, she said. A moment later, they came in sight of the brig. Its force field was transparent except for an occasional white spark. As Troy got closer, she could see a pair of booted feet inside, one crossed over the other. Lieutenant Clark, Wolverine said, without turning around. Troy took up a position in front of the brig, where she could get a good look at Wolverine. He was masked, as always. Counselor, he acknowledged. His anger was gone now, the frustration, too. A new complex of emotions was taking hold in the mutant, a mixture of happiness and relief, along with a hint of... Troy blushed. Wolverine grinned. You don't know how glad I am to see you, darling. Whatever they say I did, don't believe it. They say you were acting disorderly, the counselor told him. Prisoner shrugged. All I wanted was a glass of milk before bedtime. Is that so much to ask? Troy didn't answer his question. Instead, she said, Captain Picard's arranged for your release. Huh, Wolverine grated. I knew he'd come through for us sooner or later. Clark glanced at the Betazoid. Last chance to reconsider, she said. If I try real hard, I could convince the Admiral to keep him here. Troy couldn't help chuckling a little. Orders are orders, she said. I think you'd better release him. Reluctantly, Clark placed her hand against a plate set into the bulkhead. Then she tapped out a command on the pad below it. A minute later, the force field was gone. Oh, a moment. Sorry, not a minute. That would be a long time for the force field to be turned off. Wolverine put out his hand and confirmed the fact for himself. Satisfied, he grunted. Now that, the mutant said, is more like it. He looked at the counselor. Where's Picard? Troy gestured for Wolverine to come along. Then, with the mutant at her side, she followed Lieutenant Clark back to the Admiral's ready room. As Commander Riker entered the transporter room, he saw Lieutenant Robinson manning the controls. Nodding in a friendly way to the willowy brunette, the first officer took his place beside her. After all, the captain and their newfound guests would be beaming aboard in less than a minute. Picard had called from the starbase to say, Only a little while ago. Sir, said Robinson, as she checked her monitors. Riker turned to her. Yes, Lieutenant? She looked up at him. Are these people, these X-Men, really as super powerful as people say they are? The first officer began to say that Robinson would know as well as anyone. Then he remembered. The lieutenant, a veteran of the Enterprise D, hadn't remained with the crew when it launched the Enterprise E. She had spent some time on Earth first, and had thereby missed the ship's cross-time battle with the Borg, not to mention its encounter with the X-Men, which is not referenced as far as where source material is for that first story. Dang it. They have some unusual talents, said Riker. One of them can teleport himself around. Another one can dent duranium with a single punch. And the youngest can travel through solid matter. I've heard one of them can fly, Robinson told him. The first officer chuckled, like a bird. Hard to believe a man can do that, she said. This is very necessary dialogue. Riker shrugged. Not when you put them in context. Robinson looked at him. Context, sir? Think about some of the other beings we've run into in our travels. Take Q, for instance. Yeah, exactly. Like anyone in Star Trek has run into all kinds of beings that would be even more fantastic than a human being from Earth who has wings on his back and could fly. Their frequent visitor from the Q continuum had demonstrated his amazing powers for them time and time again. Once he had even granted the first officer a taste of them. Or the Traveler, he continued, who could manipulate the very fabric of space and time. And don't forget the Daoud, who was able to wipe out an entire race with a single thought. Riker wasn't done. In fact, he was just warming up. Then we've got the founders of the Gamma Quadrant, who can reshape themselves into anything they can imagine. And our own Mr. Data, who's as fast or powerful as any of the X-Men. Yeah, it seems like this whole conversation shouldn't have actually happened unless it was for the benefit of readers that aren't aware of the Star Trek universe. In an effort to encourage them to purchase more paperback novels in the Star Trek The Next Generation series, which are actually, hopefully, listed in the back of the book. And there are probably a couple of 300 of them. Let's see. Mr. Data, who's as fast or powerful as any of the X-Men. The transporter operator smiled. Actually, I was thinking more in terms of other humans. He looked at her. What makes you think the X-Men are human? Well, said Robinson, they're from Earth, aren't they? Maybe not our Earth, but something a lot like it? They're from Earth, all right, Riker confirmed, but apparently that doesn't make them Homo sapiens. As I understand it, some people consider them a different species entirely. The lieutenant absorbed the information. Interesting. Suddenly, she looked down at her control console. They're on their way, she reported. Just then, the doors to the room slid open, and Worf walked in. He nodded to the first officer and took up a position beside him. Come to renew old acquaintances? Asked Riker. The Klingon grunted. I seem to be doing that a lot lately. Before he had finished his comment, the transporter platform came alive with a half-dozen pillars of sparkling light. In a matter of moments, they solidified into Data, Troy, and 4 of the X-Men. Nightcrawler, Banshee, Colossus, and Wolverine. The first officer smiled at them. Welcome aboard. Nightcrawler stepped down from the platform. He walked with that strange bow-legged gait Riker remembered. Vielen Dank, said the mutant. It's nice to be aboard. Worf, grunted Wolverine. Coming forward, he held out his hand to the Klingon. Worf grasped it enthusiastically. And no wonder. In their last meeting, he had developed quite a respect for Wolverine's prowess as a warrior. You are well? Asked the Klingon. Well enough, the mutant told him. You don't have to... Oh, sorry. You don't have a brig on this bucket, do you? Worf's brow creased. In fact, we do. Why do you ask? Wolverine waved away the question. Never mind. Now that I'm here, how's about you show me that game you were telling me about, the one we didn't have time to play last time? Game, said the Klingon. Yeah, what'd you call it? Some kind of hollow whoozis? Worf suppressed a grin. Ah, yes, my calisthenics program on the holodeck. The mutant pointed to him. Yeah, that's the one. He hooked Troy by the arm. Hey, counselor, want to join us for some calisthenics? Troy sighed. Maybe another time. As she moved away, Wolverine leaned closer to the Klingon. Is it me, or has the counselor gotten a little stuffy all of a sudden? She needs to lighten up. Be more like you, Worf. Please clear the platform, said Robinson. Captain Picard and the others are ready to beam over. Banshee sighed and motioned to Colossus. Come on, Peter. I think we're standing in the way of the fast lane. As Riker watched, they stepped down and stood alongside their teammates. A moment later, 3 more columns of light appeared. In short order, they gave way to Picard, Storm, and Shadowcat. The gang's all here, said Wolverine. The captain approached Riker. Number 1, would you see to quarters for our guests? It'd be my pleasure, sir, said the first officer. In the meantime, Picard told him, I'd like to have a word with Storm. He turned to the silver-haired leader of the mutants. If that's all right with you. Storm nodded. It's not as if I have urgent business elsewhere. The captain smiled. I suppose that's true. Riker looked at his commanding officer. He hadn't seen that kind of expression on Picard's face in years. He was pleased and a little more than intrigued to see it now. Pondering the possibilities, the first officer led all the X-Men except Storm out of the transporter room. Chapter 6. Picard escorted Storm into his ready room. Offering her a seat, he went over to the replicator unit built into the bulkhead. Something to drink? He asked. She shrugged. Some tea? Herbal, if you have it. On the Enterprise, he replied. We have everything. Selecting a blend of rose hips, orange peel, and blackberry leaves, the captain programmed the replicator to manufacture it. Then he added an Earl Grey for himself. A moment later, there were 2 steaming cups of tea on the grid in front of him. He removed them and set them down on his desk. Then he came around and sat down opposite Storm. There's a problem, she said, isn't there? Picard knew exactly what she meant. Getting you home, he replied. Yes. If the information I received from Admiral Kashiwada is accurate, it appears there is. The mutant smiled bravely. I had a feeling. As I understand it, said the captain, going over what he had learned just to be certain, your time hooks malfunctioned and then disappeared. That is correct, Storm replied. Obviously, the time hook you used produced more satisfactory results. Eminently more satisfactory, said Picard. It worked perfectly, returning us to our own time and place. Nor did it disappear as yours did. Then why is there a problem? Asked the mutant. Can you not use that time hook to help us? Actually, he said, we shipped it off to Starfleet Command on Earth for testing. As it happened, it was then sent back to the Enterprise. But war with our enemies broke out, and, well, a few things were misplaced. The time hook was one of them. But can it still be retrieved? She asked. I do not believe that will be a stumbling block, the captain told her. It is simply a matter of tracking it down. He paused. On the other hand, there may be a problem with your using it. You see, if the other time hooks fail to work for you, there's every possibility this one will fail as well. Storm nodded soberly. I see. When the Admiral first notified us of your presence in our universe, Picard said, we speculated that our time hook had somehow dragged yours along with us. However, you would have appeared at the same point in time and space that we did. She sighed. And you probably appeared light years away from Starbase 88. Light years in space, he confirmed. Then he imparted the bit the woman would undoubtedly find more jarring. And nearly 12 months ago, Federation Standard Time. Storm looked at him, surprised. 12 months? You mean... It's been nearly a year since we returned to our timeline, the captain explained as gently as he could. The mutant shook her head, appearing to wrestle with the concept. So you haven't seen us for quite some time, though it seems to me as if I saw you the day before yesterday. Indeed, said Picard. Storm grunted softly. A lot of grunting in this book. No doubt you were surprised to hear from us. I was, the captain agreed, though to be honest, I often found myself thinking about you. Wow, wow, chicka wow. He realized how that must have sounded and felt his cheeks flush. It was not a pleasant sensation. That is, he added quickly, about your group. To be honest, I had never encountered anyone quite like you. The mutant took a sip of her tea, her blue eyes gleaming with reflected light. As much as a man like you must have encountered, I imagine that is saying a lot. It was, but that didn't make it any less true. In all his years of space exploration, Picard had never come across anything exactly like Storm, or for that matter, her fellow X-Men. Then, on his way back from a confrontation with the Borg in Earth's 21st century, the captain had found himself embroiled in a scheme by someone named Kang the Conqueror. Holy smokes. To disrupt established timelines. Not only the one to which Picard himself belonged, but also the one where the X-Men fought oppression and injustice. With the mutants' help, the captain and his crew had crossed timelines to thwart Kang's scheme. Then, using the villain's own time hook device, they had returned to their proper time and place. The X-Men had employed Kang's time hooks as well, with very different results, it seemed. Picard leaned forward in his seat. Rest assured, Storm, we will do everything in our power to find a way to get you home, and to do so as expeditiously as possible. Even without the time hook devices, there are other methods, other options at our disposal. However, finding the right one will require your cooperation. Ororo, she said. He looked at her, puzzled by her response. Beg your pardon. My name is Ororo, she told him. Storm is just my nom de guerre. The captain smiled. Ororo, then. He resisted, inviting her to call him Jean-Luc. As I was saying, we will require your cooperation if we are to help you. I mean, I don't feel like that needed to be said the first time, let alone a second time. Oh, goodness. We need to determine why the Enterprise returned to its programmed time and place, and your X-Men did not. What sort of cooperation did you have in mind? She asked. Dr. Crusher and Commander LaForge would like to conduct some tests, Picard explained. They will be painless, of course. But with any luck, they will tell us why you were deposited in our timeline. The mutant thought for a moment. I cannot say I love the idea, she said. What is the why? There's no details about what these tests entail. Why would you object? They're probably going to scan you with like a laser pen or something. Oh, goodness. I do not think these tests will pose a problem. The captain nodded. Good. Storm glanced at one of the observation ports where she could see the stars streaking by. Do you deal with things like this all the time? She wondered. Cross-temporal anomalies and such? More often than I would like, Picard admitted. She turned to him again, able to joke despite her team's plight. Then whatever they pay you, it is not enough. Since we aren't paid as much... as such, certainly not, he said. The mutant glanced at the observation port again. We are moving at a considerable rate of speed. I take it you have been assigned a mission. Only in the broadest sense. I have been asked to attend a planning meeting on another star base. It pertains to an ally of our Federation known as the Klingon Empire. Commander Worf's people. Same, Captain told her, pleased that she had made the connection. Fortunately, neither Dr. Crusher nor Commander LaForge will be involved in the planning meeting, so your problem will not be neglected. In any case, I hope you and your comrades will make yourselves comfortable while you are here. Thank you, Storm replied. You are very kind. For a second or so, neither of them spoke, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence by any means. Strange as it seemed, Picard felt as if he had known the woman all his life. Why? Tell us why, writer. It's a good time for you to tell us why he feels that way. Feel special, reader. You're getting to experience a singular moment in Star Trek history because Picard's never felt this way about anybody. This is the worst kind of writing. Not the book in its entirety. Just there's so much more of it lately with the amount of shows on streaming services and just sentimental claptrap in movies where they don't actually justify these sort of moments. They just tell you you're supposed to feel like this is the most special thing that's ever. I've never met anyone like you. All right, I'll just take that on faith then. Let's see. May I ask you a question? She said at last. By all means, he responded. The mutant leaned forward. Do you never get lonely here, so far from the planet of your birth? The captain shook his head. Not at all. I chose this life. In fact, I aspired to it, he smiled. Nothing gives me more pleasure than traveling from star to star, seeing what no one has seen before. She smiled too. I cannot say the same. And why is that? I have a bond with the Earth's biosphere, Storm explained. It is an essential component of my mutant powers. I find it difficult to be away from Earth for too long. Picard regarded her. You would have gotten along with my brother Robert, he said. She tilted her head to one side. Would have. He perished in a fire, the captain told her, along with my nephew. I set the fire. No, sorry. It took me a long time to accept their loss. Silence again and again. It was Storm who ended it. I know what it is like to lose people close to you. I lost my parents when I was very young. Picard saw the pain in the woman's eyes. Another thing that only writers believe is possible. It must have been hard for you to go on. No, not if you're a child. There's no. Sorry, everybody. Children are very resilient, and they accept whatever is happening as reality as it happens, and they continue to live. It's adults that have a hard time moving on. No child is just like, well, they're packing it in. I see no potential in this life. They don't know that they don't know that they have a choice. I'm not a child psychologist. I'm just basing this on my observations in life. What do I know? Not even a parent. All right. I don't even have kids. What would I know? And I'm not a published author like Jan Michael Vincent Marty Friedman here. And I'm happy that this author made money doing this. I'm not crapping on them personally or professionally in a larger sense. Just professionally in a very tiny specific sense when I'm talking smack here. So, let's see. It was very hard. Even as an adult, I have nightmares about it. The captain was surprised to see how vulnerable Storm could allow herself to be. To this point, he had seen her only as a warrior and a leader. Now he saw the lonely child in her as well, and he felt privileged to have the opportunity to do so. Her eyes seemed to lose focus. How lovely, she said. Picard didn't understand. To what are you referring? Sorry if I'm getting snippy about this. Storm's a great character, and she's always, as written, projected sensitivity with a regal sort of way of being and authority, but never like this hard and unemotional warrior without empathy or humanity or anything. I think we're taking some liberties. Here with the character to make Picard, feel special or something. He's special enough. He's Jean-Luc Picard. We don't need to make this stuff up. Storm pointed to a Resican flute he had kept on his desk, a small, simple instrument made of tin-like material. It was tin-like material. How about, I don't know, just describe the metal. Don't say it's like something that we already have in our whatever. Okay, never mind. Because they're from Earth, right? So it would be tin, or it would be a shiny metal of some kind, or a gleaming. Is it from? I guess it could be from another. Resican flute? I suppose that's from another planet. Made of a tin-like material. It was one like the stuff that you would store vegetables in the 30s. I don't know. It was one of the few personal items he had been able to salvage from his quarters on the Enterprise D. How? That could be a story we'd like to hear. Did he run back for the flute before they had to leave the ship or before it was exploded? I don't remember what happened to the Enterprise D. I tell a lie. To say I don't remember would mean that I knew what the actual story was at one point. She turned to him again. Do you play it? The captain nodded. On occasion. I love the music that comes out of it. But it represents another tragedy, I'm afraid. The death of a civilization on a planet called Catan. You mourn the death of an entire civilization? Storm asked. In a way, he said, you see, when the people of Catan were dying, they wanted desperately to be remembered. So they sent out a space probe containing the memories of an Iron Weaver named Cayman. As it happened, I was the one who received Cayman's memories, as well as the flute and the knowledge of how to play it. She looked at him. There is more. More? Picard asked, surprised. Yes, something about the flute you have not mentioned. Suddenly he realized what she was talking about. I had a friendship with someone a few years ago. She played an instrument as well. Yeah, I bet you did. We enjoyed participating in duets. I bet you did. Funny, the captain thought, how dry he managed to make it sound. How lifeless. But then he was unaccustomed to opening up to someone as he was opening up to the mutant. You no longer have... How about the woman? How about the leader of the X-Men? You no longer have these duets? Storm asks. She's trying to make sure he's free, right? Like, she's ready. She's ready to start a duet of her own. Was not so much a question as an observation. No longer, he said. Our careers got in the way of our friendship, the mutant suggested, using Picard's word for it. Yes, we know. We were here, reading it in the page just a paragraph ago. Jan Michael Vincent Marty Friedman. We know. Yes, I found it. I could not act effectively as her commanding officer and care for her at the same time. Storm digested the remark. Leaders seldom enjoy stable relationships. It is one of the burdens one must bear when one assumes responsibility for the lives of others. So I learned, the captain responded. So how old, somebody call in right now and tell me if you know Star Trek, how old was he when this supposedly happened? Was he like Jean-Luc Picard age as we know him? Like well past middle age? Or was he, like was it a flashback episode where he was a stroppy teen and had a hot sexual relationship with somebody under him, figuratively in the chain of command? I feel like he should have learned that lesson before becoming a middle-aged or older man that we picture in our heads as Jean-Luc Picard. But maybe I'm just being extra crappy. Trying to poke too many holes after seeing the ones that they've been throwing in my face so far. Storm digested the remark. Leaders must seldom. Yep, sorry, read that part already. Except, she said. He looked at her, except. Storm returned his scrutiny for what seemed like a long time. At last, she shook her head. Nothing, she told him at last. Sorry, I did not mean to pry so into your personal life. Rising, she picked up her cup and saucer and returned them to the replicator slot. She then turned to Picard and smiled. Thank you again, Storm said, for everything. Captain stood too. It is nothing, he assured her. With a last glance at him, she crossed the room and left through the sliding doors. A breeze seemed to attend her, making her hair and her garments undulate in response. Picard sat back in his chair and sighed. He would have given much to know what thought Storm had declined to finish. Wow. There we go. That's chapter 6. Let's check out chapter 7 as I go back to my Facebook profile and just check to make sure we're still going. Audio. Yep. Good. And unlike previous streams in previous years, the stream is only a few seconds behind. So chapter 7. His arms folded across his chest against the afternoon chill. Arid. Oh, this bore. Back to the main character, I guess. Let's see. He watched the shadows lengthen in the fortress's yard. They had already reached the opposite wall and climbed halfway up its stone surface. Soon the guards would call down to the transformed and send them back to their rooms. It was difficult enough to keep an eye on the growing prisoner population during the day. At night, however, it would be nearly impossible. At least, that's how the transformed interpreted the situation. Suddenly, Arid experienced an unexpected sensation. He felt as if someone were whispering in his ear, though he couldn't see anyone within several meters of him. And it wasn't exactly a whisper. True, there were words in his head, but they seemed to manifest themselves without sound. Don't be afraid. My name is Paldul. Arid looked around. He saw the youth with the green pockmarks in his forehead sitting among some of the other transformed. The others were talking, but Paldul didn't seem to be listening to them. His eyes were closed, his head tilted back slightly. Yes, Arid thought. I know your name. I heard someone say it the day you arrived here. And yours? Asked the telepath. Arid Sovar. Pleased to meet you, Arid. There was an undercurrent of something like humor. I'll bet you've never spoken with your mind before. That's true, Arid replied. Neither did I, said Paldul. Before my transformation. Now I do it quite a bit. Every chance I get, in fact. How many others have you spoken with? Arid inquired. Here in the fortress, I mean. Almost everyone, Paldul told him, except for Moloch, of course. Moloch. Erid had never heard the name before. He's insane, the telepath thought matter-of-factly, and dangerous too. He can set things aflame just by looking at them, so they don't dare let him out into the yard. Erid wondered what it was like to visit the mind of a crazy person. Not pleasant, Paldul thought, surprising him. At least in Moloch's case, it's not. I never visited the mind of any other mental patient, so I can't say that's true as a rule. Erid frowned. It must be nice to have a power like yours. You don't have to worry about it getting out of control, and you can exercise it without the guards trying to stun you. There was another undercurrent of humor. That's true. But it wasn't nice at all when the power first came to me. I kept hearing all the thoughts of everyone around me, all the time and all at once. It took me a couple of days to learn to shut them out, to focus on hearing only what I wanted to hear. 2 days, thought Erid. He had had his power a lot longer than that, and he still hadn't learned to control it. But then he didn't have the luxury of using his talent in public. He was forced to practice it in his cell at night, projecting tiny rays of energy over and over again until he was too tired to keep his eyes open. I envy you, he thought at Paldul. The youth smiled. The one I envy is Rahatan. He's the only one with the courage to stand up to our guards, in fact. What? Thought Erid. You'll see, Paldul told him, with just a hint of amusement. Erid asked him for explanation again, but there was no answer in his head. Paldul had gone away. With that realization came a great emptiness, a loneliness Erid had never felt before. But then he had never shared his thoughts with another Zaldian. Suddenly, he was jolted by a loud sound, a voice from directly above him. Day's over, the Prime Guard bellowed. He was a tall, rangy man with a long, lined face. Time for last meal. Erid studied the wall on the opposite side of the yard. Sure enough, the shadow had climbed almost to the top of it. In a half hour or so, the sun would go down. He started in the direction of the mess hall, telling himself it wasn't so bad that they had to leave the yard. As much as he had eaten at second meal, his hunger was already beginning to gnaw at him. This is ridiculous, someone cried out in a strident voice. As the cry echoed from wall to wall, all eyes turned to its source. Erid was no exception. What he saw was Rahatan. The transformed's gaze was fixed on the Prime Guard, his hands held out in a plea for a reason. It's still light out, said Rahatan. Erid was reminded of the thought Paldul had sent him moments earlier. And the author's about to remind us. The one I envy is Rahatan. He's the only one with the courage to stand up to our guards. We just said that. We know. We know that happened. For crying out loud. Oh, so much padding. So much padding to make this 265-page book happen. Whew. All right. Carrying on. I know it's for kids. I get it. But still. Before X-Men and Star Trek crossovers, little kids read stuff that was smarter than this too. That may be true, the Prime Guard allowed, but it doesn't change anything. Rules are rules. There's no reason to rush us, Rahatan insisted. He took in some of the other transformed with a glance. Sorry, everybody. Am I right? His challenge was met by a rumble of assent. After all, none of the prisoners ever liked to leave the yard. Dinara looked up at the Prime Guard as well. Would another few minutes really hurt, she asked. It's little enough to ask, agreed Layden. The head guard raised his weapon and pointed it at Rahatan. Don't make me use this, he said. The youth smiled. I'm not making you do anything. Sevian came over to him. That is unnecessary, she told Rahatan. I'll decide what's necessary, he returned, glancing at her. You'll just get yourself stunned, Sevian insisted. Rahatan chuckled. Will I? Then he looked to the head guard again. Just leave us alone and there won't be any trouble. Yeah, it's like putting all these like newly superpowered youths together in an open sort of coliseum or field with no restraints. It was probably not a good idea. Twice a day or whatever the hell it is, so they can all cook up schemes against you. The guard's eyes narrowed. Trouble? Is that a threat? Rahatan shook his head. A force of nature doesn't threaten. It acts without warning. Suddenly, the high stone wall began to shudder under the guard's feet, loosening tiny pieces of mortar. Wide-eyed, uncertain of his footing, the prime guard thrust a hand out to support himself, almost dropping his stun weapon in the process. "What's going on?" one of the other guards barked. Arid knew the answer. He could see it in Rahatan's smile, in the way he held his hands out. So that was the newcomer's power, he thought. Rahatan could move things, perhaps a great many things. But what he was moving at that moment was the earth beneath the fortress wall, causing the barrier to be tremble and scare the life out of the guards. "It's that one," the prime guard concluded. The one that was threatening you. "Yes, he's doing it." "And what if I am?" asked Rahatan, seemingly unconcerned. The prime guard didn't answer. He just braced himself as best he could, took aim, and fired a stun blast. Nor was he the only one. Rahatan didn't make a move to elude his fate. He stood there and accepted it, and, before the eyes of everyone assembled, endured the indignity of the guard's barrage. It made him shiver and twitch uncontrollably, then fall to his knees. His eyes rolled back in his head, and his jaws worked furiously. Spittle ran from the corner of his mouth. The ordeal lasted only a second or two, but by the time the guard stopped firing, Rahatan had pitched forward and lost consciousness. He lay stretched out on the ground, paler than any living being had a right to be. "Monsters!" bellowed Layden, shaking his fists at the guards. "What have you done to him?" Dinara demanded. Meanwhile, the shuddering of the walls had stopped. But despite that, the guards didn't look as if they felt very secure. "Disperse!" cried their prime, aiming his rifle at Layden and then at Dinara. "Walk away!" "Or what?" asked the youth with the luminous eyes. "Will you do to us what you did to him?" Yes, that is what they will. That is plainly what they intend to do and have done repeatedly. There is a precedent for this, and it's the only thing you should expect. Clearly, the guards didn't want to fire at anyone else. Their expressions were proof of that, but the cries of the transformed had begun to sound too much like rebellion. Then a handful of them began to move in the direction of the prime guard, or more accurately, the wall beneath his feet. Layden and Dinara and the man with the luminous eyes were among them. Korba might have advanced with them too, but she had paused to kneel at Rahatan's side. "Stay back," Prime Guard yelled sharply, glaring at Layden and Dinara and the others. His admonition had no effect. The transformed kept coming. When Layden had reached the wall, he hit it with the heel of his hand. Amazingly, the stone and mortar cracked under the blow, giving him a handhold. With the heel of his other hand, Layden smashed another hole in the wall. To Arid, at least, the transformed's intention was clear. Making hand and footholds as he went, he was going to climb the barrier. Layden could never do it quickly enough to actually reach the Prime Guard, but that didn't seem to discourage him in the past. "Stop him!" cried the Prime Guard. With that, he and his men unleashed another barrage. No doubt it would have racked Layden as it had Rahatan, except Dinara advanced to the strong man's side. Arid had never seen her activate her shielding until that moment. He hadn't known she could extend it to protect someone else. But as he looked on, that was just what she appeared to do. The stun barrage should have subdued Layden. It should have sent him crashing to the ground, but thanks to Dinara, it didn't. Together, the two of them withstood volley after volley from the guards. Layden even got a chance to take a couple more pieces out of the wall. In time, however, Dinara's shielding seemed to weaken. The stun blasts began to get through. Layden cried out as if in agony and went lurching away from her. And once he was no longer under Dinara's protection, he was as vulnerable as any of them. In a moment or two, he was writhing and convulsing like a fish out of water. In another, he was on the ground, spent and senseless. But the guards weren't finished. After all, Dinara had defied them as well. They kept up their barrage until she, too, began to stagger. She cursed them through clenched teeth. That is one of the greatest offenses of hack writers in action stories. Talking through clenched teeth. Just describe something that only happens visually in comic books. Then her shielding gave away, and the stun fire got to her. For a moment, convulsed so badly it was agony for Arid to watch. Then, mercifully, she, too, lost consciousness. The guards looked around, wary of other prisoners. But the yard was quiet. Ominously so. No one moved. No one even breathed, it seemed. In the wake of the battle, for that was what it had been. I mean, we just read it. I don't know that you need to tell us. That was a battle that I just described to you. The Prime Guard wiped his brow with the back of his hand. Then he indicated Rahatan, Laden, and Dinara with a gesture. Pick them up and put them in cells, he told his men, and lock them so they can't get out. Isn't that what everyone's situation is in this prison? They're all locked in cells so they can't get out. Isn't that the point of them having this free time away from their cells? Some of the guards descended from the battlements and entered the yard, their weapons at the ready, and none of the transformed moved to stop them as they carried out the Prime Guard's orders. It was only after they disappeared with Rahatan, Laden, and Dinara that the remaining prisoners began to exchange glances. Irid found himself studying Korba's face. He saw pain in her eyes and hatred. He couldn't help wondering what she saw in his. All right, back to characters that we care about. Chapter 8. As Geordi entered sickbay, tricorder in hand, Nightcrawler was already standing there waiting for him. Not far away, Colossus, whose real name was Peter, was lying full length on the bio bed while Dr. Crusher ran some routine scans on him. Sorry about that noise. But the doctor's responsibility began and ended with medical anomalies. It was the chief engineer's job to put the X-Men's abilities under a microscope, figuratively speaking, of course. As he caught sight of Geordi, Nightcrawler held his hands out. "So what can I do for you?" he asked congenially. Clearly, he was the blithe spirit of the group. The engineer had always appreciated people like that. "What I want to see," Geordi explained, "is how your teleportation ability works. For instance, if it's anything like our transporters." "And how do they work?" asked Nightcrawler. "Basically," said the engineer, "they convert matter to energy, then send it from one place to another along a sort of guide beam. When the energy reaches the second location, it's converted back into matter." Well, there you go, folks. The whole process explained. The mutant dismissed the idea with a wave of his three-fingered hand. "My teleportation ability works nothing like that." "How do you know?" Geordi asked. "Professor Xavier has explained it to me." The engineer looked at him, and he would be the mutant who saved my life from an angry mob, said Nightcrawler, and recruited me into the X-Men. A brilliant geneticist, and perhaps the most powerful telepath on Earth. Geordi nodded. "Okay. And what did Professor Xavier tell you about your teleportation talent?" "What happens," the mutant replied, "is I enter an entirely separate dimension. Somehow, though I have no awareness of it, I travel through that other dimension. Then I come out again in my own dimension, an equivalent distance from where I started." The engineer smiled. "An intriguing theory. Still, I'd like to check it out for myself, if you have no objections." "None," the mutant told him. Geordi finished calibrating his tricorder. "This'll just take a second." "Just say the word," Nightcrawler advised him. Finally, he looked up. All set. A moment later, there was a soft pop, and the teleporter was gone. In his place, there was a puff of smoke and a burning smell. Almost instantly, Nightcrawler was back again, but this time, he was on the other side of the room, his lips pulled back in a grin. "Miss me?" he asked the engineer. Geordi chuckled, then consulted his tricorder. "How about that?" "How about what?" "You were gone all right for a fraction of a second. It was as if you didn't exist." "At least not in this dimension," Nightcrawler noted. The engineer continued to study his readout. "Now that's interesting." "What is?" asked the mutant. Geordi showed him the tricorder. "When you left, there was nothing remarkable about you, but when you came back, you were literally dusted with Verteron particles." Nightcrawler looked at him. "Verteron?" "Sorry," said the engineer. He'd forgotten that in a mutant's universe, which is roughly equivalent to his, but in the 20th century, Verterons probably hadn't been discovered yet. Oh, convenient. Nice little maneuver here. They're subatomic particles associated with subspace phenomena. Nightcrawler still didn't look enlightened. "Subspace?" "A spatial continuum," said Geordi, "with different properties from our own. It's by ducking into subspace that the Enterprise is able to travel at faster than light speeds." Okay. Which leads us to an interesting question. The mutant tilted his head. "That being?" whether this other dimension you're traveling in isn't related to subspace. I mean, we don't come out of warp smelling like brimstone. At least, I don't think we do. But the presence of those verterons suggested you're doing with mind and body what we need an entire warp drive to accomplish. Geordi looked at his guest with newfound respect. Let me tell you, if that's true, it's pretty amazing. Nightcrawler stroked his blue-furred chin, his golden eyes fixed on the possibilities, of which there were many. His golden eyes fixed on the possibilities of... like around the room? Does that mean, he said, there's a way for me to travel from world to world? Maybe even star to star, without benefit of a ship? Geordi thought about it. Maybe, he conceded at last, but then again, maybe not. I mean, that's quite a stretch from what... I mean, okay, clearly, I'm not an intellectual. I'm more of an X-Men fan than a Star Trek fan, if it's not painfully obvious. So, at this point in the 90s, we definitely knew that Nightcrawler's teleporting ability, you know, is sort of finite based on how much physical, like, energy drain he can withstand. Every time he goes longer distances, he's, you know, more likely to get knocked unconscious or something, or risk death if he travels too far at once, especially if he's carrying another person. So I don't know why Kurt Wagner would suggest that he could travel from planet to planet with his teleportation ability as it exists. And he can't go anywhere that he can't see. So I feel like he should be saying that right now. Like, if it weren't for this and this and this, maybe I could travel from planet to planet. I don't know. Geordi thought about it. Maybe, he conceded at last. But then again, maybe not. Nightcrawler looked at him quizzically. You see, the engineer said, even after we enter subspace, we still have to apply a lot of power to move the ship from place to place. It's true. Your mass wouldn't be anywhere near that of the Enterprise. But then in subspace, mass isn't really the main issue. In other words, said the mutant, trying to boil down Geordi's comment, it wouldn't be enough just to access this continuum or whatever it is. It would also have to have a way to propel myself across it. The engineer took a breath and then let it out. I think so, but honestly, I'm just taking a stab at it. I'd have to study you a lot more closely to come up with an accurate answer. Nightcrawler shrugged. I am game if you are. Maybe later, Geordi said. Right now, I want to run some computer models with regard to those verteron particles you're wearing. The mutant's brow creased. Why? You think they have something to do with our time hooks malfunctioning? I think it's a possibility, the engineer told him. And if that's the case, said Nightcrawler, it'd be silly not to check it out. Geordi smiled. You said it, not me. Having a good old time with those verteron particles. Okay. When Irid... Oh, boo. When Irid emerged from the mess hall, hugging the high wall on the right, as always, he saw new faces among the guards on the parapets. Apparently, Rahatan's act of rebellion had gotten the government's attention. Reinforcements had arrived overnight. A few new transformed were in the evidence also, but yeah, why not? Why not just keep adding more superpowered beings to the pile? Don't isolate them. I mean, they're doing a terrible job of creating a prison planet here. Let's see. Osan had restricted them to their cells, meaning Dinara, Layden, and Rahatan, as the Prime Guard had recommended the day before. Still, Irid thought, Rahatan had a powerful talent at his fingertips. So did Layden, for that matter. If either of them wanted to escape their containment, they might have done it. In fact, if he were Osan, he would have seen to it that Rahatan and Layden were guarded around the clock. And maybe Dinara as well. Anything less would have been foolish. Right. So why is it happening? Then Irid had a terrible thought. What if Rahatan and the others had been deemed too dangerous to confine? What if the administrator of the fortress had decided to kill them instead? It was hard to believe someone could be destroyed for an insignificant offense. However, worse offenses might follow, probably would follow, if Irid was any judge of character, and the government had never faced anything like the transformed before. Irid, came a voice from behind him. He turned and saw it was Korba who had spoken to him. She tilted her head slightly. That's your name, isn't it? Irid nodded, intrigued by her strange, quick way of talking. Yes. You don't talk that much. Korba observed. He shrugged. I think a lot. About what you've become, she said. That, he replied, and other things. Korba glanced at the opposite wall, where the guards were looking down on the yard. Irid glanced that way, too. Their conversation hadn't drawn any special attention, but then they were hardly the only ones conversing. Other things? She echoed. Like what? Like how much I hate it here, he told her. He hadn't intended to say that, but it had been days since he exchanged more than a couple of superficial words with anyone, and the sentiment had simply come pouring out. We all hate it, Korba answered. That's why Rahatan did what he did yesterday, because we're people, not animals. We're not supposed to be caged up. No, Irid said, we're not. Her gaze seemed to harden, become more resolute. And with any luck, we won't be caged up much longer. We won't be caged much longer. He didn't understand. He told her so. Again, Korba cast a glance at the battlements. Rahatan wants to break out of this place. Irid looked at her. Break. He shook his head. But how do you know? Puldu contacted himself in his cell. She said, he can do that. Rahatan told him we don't need to stay here any longer, not with the powers we've got. He swallowed, but the guards. Korba frowned. All we need to do is work together. That's what Rahatan says. If we do that, the guards can't stop us. Irid felt his cheeks flush. And the others? I've spoken with half a dozen transform myself, she said. No one's turning me down yet. They're all sick of being here. Suddenly, Irid was more frightened than ever. It was bad enough that he had become some kind of freak, and worse still that he had been imprisoned because of it. But now he was contemplating an act of violence, one that would forever alienate him from Zaldian society. And yet he thought if he didn't do it, he would be alienated from a different kind of society. Maybe the only kind realistically left to him. He took a breath, then let it out. Has Rahatan got a plan? Irid inquired. Korba nodded, which is just Cobra with the R and the B flipped around. Whatever. You run out of ways to think of new alien names after a while. I get it. Then she told him what it was and what role had been chosen for Irid in it. So you're with us? She asked. She quirked a smile. Or do you like the way it feels when they stun you in the yard? Okay, or do you like the way it feels when they stun you in the yard? He thought about it. If Rahatan was right and they were able to break out of this fortress, he might never have to feel a stun blast again. Irid swallowed even harder. Gulp. I'm with you. Chapter 9. Let's move things around to make it exciting. Woo! Boop, 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 boop. Isn't that exciting? Now the whole there you go. Visually, the whole landscape's different now. Chapter 9. The holodeck doors opened with a soft hiss. Worf found himself bathed in sun and shadow as he studied the scene in front of him. Wolverine, who is standing beside him, just grunted. Again, lots of grunting in the story. They were in a clearing in the middle of a steamy tropical jungle. A blood black. Oh, so they're gonna do like it's like this is just like our danger room back home, sort of a thing. Blood black and white stone altar was the only man-made structure in sight. Birds screamed from high up in the lush golden foliage and darted across a patch of crimson sky. Half-seen creatures peered out from their sun-dappled hiding places with wide, frightened-looking eyes. Nice place you got here, Wolverine rasped. He wiped sweat from his eyes with the back of his hand. I prefer something a little frostier myself, but to each his own. As it happened, Worf had no particular liking for this place either. The flora gave off a most unpleasant scent. Still, the program had been a gift from his son, Alexander, who had been living with Worf's foster parents back on Earth at the time. And if one could ignore the smell, the opportunities for battle were most exhilarating. Hefting his bat'leth, the Klingon turned to his guest. If any of you have a problem with the way I'm going to pronounce Klingon words, you can go to hell. I do not have a formal education in these matters. Whoop. Whoop, 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 whoop. Whoop, 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 whoop. Hope no one is too confused if you're listening on audio after the fact. I'm playing with video screens right now. Okay. Taking a couple of steps Oh, wait, excuse me. Yeah, you're certain you don't require a weapon? That's what he said. It wasn't the first time he had asked. The mutant held up his fist, showing Worf the deadly sharp spars of bone. Oh, we're after. Okay, that's where we're at in the X-Men timeline. Okay, so we've had the adamantium pulled out of Wolverine's bones, and that means this is. I mean, I could have just looked at the copyright on the book once again, but I'm just doing the math in my head. Okay, probably late. It's like late 90s or whatever. I've got all the weapons I need right here, he said. The Klingon had seen Wolverine use his claws to considerable advantage. Very well, he said. Taking a couple of steps in the direction of the altar, he felt the program respond to his presence. The shrieks of the birds grew louder, the wind in the trees fiercer, the sense of danger more immediate. Worf could feel his pulse quickening, his blood growing hotter. His lips pulled back in anticipation of the battle to come, and Wolverine was right behind him, his eyes sliding warily from side to side. His nostrils flaring beneath his mask. It seemed he could sense the danger as well. But then, as Worf understood it, the mutant's faculties of smell and hearing, not to mention his most basic primitive instincts, were far superior to those of normal humans. In that regard, Wolverine was more like the Terran predator he had been named for. Or, Worf thought, more like a Klingon. The only thing about Wolverine he didn't understand was the mutant's disguise. If a warrior concealed his identity from others, how could he bring honor to his house? They're out there, Wolverine whispered. Indeed, Worf responded. The mutant's lip curled. So what are they waiting for? As if that were a cue, adversaries charged them from 4 different directions. Worf flung his bat'leth up in time to ward off the mace-like stroke of a hulking, blue-skinned Pandrolite, then whirled and parried the sword thrust of a lightning-quick Orion. A glance told him Wolverine wasn't bored either. A Chardini whipmaster was trying to snare the mutant's ankles while a Drillican assassin looped a garrote around his neck. With the claws in one hand, Wolverine sliced off the business end of the whip and drove his fist into the Chardini's face. Unfortunately, he wasn't quick enough to prevent the garrote from taking hold around his neck, but even then, he was far from vanquished. Driving his elbow into the Drillican's ribs, the mutant cracked a couple, forcing his adversary to loosen his grip. Good thing these aliens have the same skeletal structure as a human being that Wolverine is used to fighting. I don't know. Maybe that was the choice. That was the choice when they created the holodeck program for this. Then, with some room in which to work, he slashed the assassin's belly. Worf, meanwhile, was getting a workout. No sooner had he opened the Pandrolite's throat with his bat'leth than the Orion was on the attack again. Ducking the green man's flashing steel, the Klingon parried a second assault and a third. Then, just as the Orion thought he was gaining the advantage, Worf struck low and swept his legs out from under him. With a single quick thrust, the Klingon finished off his adversary. Some of Worf's colleagues might have been shocked at his love of violence, but not Wolverine, he knew. Turning to the mutants, the Klingon grinned. Wolverine was grinning too. Not bad for a start, he jibed. But when are we going to see some real action? In answer to his question, a shaggy Bandalar dropped on him from the trees above. Pinning the mutant to the ground, he raised a large and deadly-looking axe over his head. Taking 2 quick steps, Worf hurled himself at the Bandalar. He managed to knock the alien off balance before he could bring his weapon down on Wolverine's head. Then, before the Bandalar could recover, the Klingon sliced his axe handle in 2. Weaponless, the alien reached out and grasped Worf's naked throat. The Klingon felt his windpipe closing in the Bandalar's vice-like grip. Reluctant to let his enemy finish the job, he plunged the point of his bat'leth into his opponent's ribs. That made the Bandalar let go in a hurry. With his throat open for business again, Worf raised his weapon and savagely terminated his adversary's brief existence. That's when he saw something big and dark hurtling out of the jungle at him. A Shiritan trident warrior, he thought. Whirling, he tried to brace himself for the newcomer's attack. It turned out not to be necessary. Before the Shiritan could get anywhere near the Klingon, Wolverine tackled him. For a moment, the Trident Warrior and the mutant rolled across the clearing, driven by their momentum. Oh, that's an interesting thing to be driven by. When somebody jumps on somebody and they roll away. They scrambled to their feet, separated by less than a meter. The Shiritan thrust his weapon at Wolverine, who caught it and broke its shaft over his knee. As the alien tried again to regain his balance... Sorry, I read that wrong. As the alien tried to regain his balance, the mutant drove his heel into the Shritan's belly. I'm sorry, I'm just going to be nitpicky because it's Shriton, Shriiton, in the previous sentence, and then it's Shriton, Shritton, one I, two T's, or two I's and one T. It's tripping me up. Not my fault. It's not my fault, I said through clenched teeth. What's going on the screen here? Woo! All right. Let's move that there. That there. Okay. That was important. All that screen moving aroundedness. Let's see. The alien tried to regain his balance. The mutant drove his heel into the Shriton's belly. When the Trident Warrior groaned and doubled over, Wolverine laced his fingers together, delivered a two-handed blow to the back of the neck. Oh, in true vintage Star Trek fashion. The Shriton collapsed and fell on his face. After a moment or two, it was clear he wasn't getting up again. He just hit him that hard. The mutant made a show of brushing off his hands, then turned to Worf. "Don't tell me that's it," he said. "Actually," the Klingon told him, "we were just warming up." He looked up. "Computer, level 4. Wolverine's eyes narrowed. "Jeez, Worf, you mean we've been lounging on level 3 the whole time?" Klingon shook his head. "No, on level 1. Then there was no time to talk. He was too busy defending himself against one enemy after the other. All right, so not exactly Robert E. Howard when it comes to the description of the action and the violence, but moving along. As Reed sat with his back against the fortress wall, he felt a voice in his head. He had heard it before, of course, but never charged with such a sense of excitement. "You'll take out the man to the right of the Prime Guard." Reed looked at Paldul, who was sitting in the sun at the other side of the yard. Thanks to his telepathic abilities, he had become the link between Rahatan and the other transformed. "I hear you," Reed thought. He glanced at the guard in question, gauging the distance between them. "And I'll be ready." "Good," thought Paldul. "Wait for my signal." Reed waited. While he did this, he thought about his parents. The first thing he would do when he was free was get in touch with them and let them know he was alive, and then get them captured, I'm sure, and indicted as part of a conspiracy. Good thinking. Good thinking, Reed. And after that, he had no idea, really. As far as he knew, none of the others did either. The need to escape loomed so large in their minds, there didn't seem to be room for anything else. Maybe there was nothing they could do. Maybe this escape of theirs wouldn't accomplish anything in the long run, and they would end up back inside these walls, or in another fortress somewhere else. But if their efforts only alerted the world to their plight, it would be worth the effort. Abruptly, he felt the voice in his head again. "Ready," it said, "on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Pointing his right hand at the guard assigned to him, Arid unleashed a beam of brilliant white energy. It struck the man before he had any inkling he was threatened, causing him to drop his weapon and to collapse on the battlement. Arid was pleased with his accuracy. His nightly practices had improved his skill with his energy releases. But he had never consciously set out a bolt so powerful or over such a great distance. Meanwhile, his assault hadn't been the only one. Far from it. All over the yard, every one of the transformed with a projectable energy power had put it to use simultaneously, creating a bizarre, multicolored barrage. Half a dozen guards were jolted off their feet, and those who weren't had no better time of it. One was struck by an invisible assailant who then grabbed his weapon and cracked him across the face with it. Another found himself firing at an adversary who was only an illusion and hitting one of his comrades instead. A third tried to track a blur of speed and couldn't, firing instead at the places where Korba had been. It was chaos. But as Irid shot another stream of energy, spinning a guard around, he began to imagine their plan might work. Then he felt the ground tremble. And by that sign, he knew Rahtan would soon be joining the fray. Also, Layden and Dinara, who had been imprisoned in cells alongside him. Joining the fray, it just reminded me that when I was in 6th grade, I wrote some, you have to like make up stories for language arts class or whatever. I wrote a story with that phrase in it. Someone leapt into the fray because I read too many comic books, or I read any comic books, which is probably too many if you're a aspiring writer at that age, which I might have been, except for my language arts teacher took points off my story because she didn't believe that was a real word to be used as a noun, only as a verb when something phrase, not something that you leap into. But I read comic books and I knew that was just, normal language. Let's see. Watch out, he heard someone cry. A fraction of a second later, Irid was smashed hard in the ribs and taken off his feet. At the same time, a stun blast splattered against the wall like it was made of gack or slime, I guess, where he had been standing. Again, someone is describing the visuals of a comic book panel when you draw energy beams, like hitting some force field and they sort of spray out, but you wouldn't want to use the English language to describe that as a splattering, I wouldn't think, unless you tell us that the energy beams are semi-liquid in nature, I suppose. I know, I'm being too hard on Michael Vincent Friedman, Marty Friedman. At the same time, a stun blast splattered against the wall where he had been standing. He looked up into the face of his savior and saw the man with the luminous eyes. "Thank you," Irid said. "Don't mention it," the other transformed replied. Eyeing the guards warily, he got to his feet and began to move off. "Just keep doing what you were doing, all right?" Irid nodded. "I will." But he was only instructed to take out one guard, and he already did that. And now he's attacking other guards. This could get very chaotic very fast if there isn't a plan for what everyone is supposed to do to everyone else specifically. I don't like it. I don't trust this plan. I've already started thinking ahead, like, oh, what if this is a ruse? What if this is a ruse to get some of them captured and the rest of them are part of the conspiracy to provoke the transformed into getting extra punished? And then I realized, no, that is overthinking. There's no way that this plot is that smart. I, a 45-year-old reading a young adult novel and a person who has never been published, am much smarter than this material I'm reading, I say. Deal with that. Deal with that, publishing industry. Arid nodded, "I will." Whatever the other man's power was, it didn't seem to be very useful in a fight, but to his credit, he was looking for other ways to help. Turning to the battlements, Irid picked out another guard and extended his hand. Once again, a crackling stream of energy traversed the yard and found its target, slamming the man into the wall behind him. Additional guards raced out into the parapets, replacing those who had fallen. They fired down into the yard, stunning a transformed with 4 arms and another who had generated a net of electricity. But they couldn't stun everyone, not when Korba was running around disrupting their aim, not when one of the transformed had grown 12 feet tall, so as to be a better target, I would assume, and was throwing them off the battlements like dolls. Okay, I get it. Sorry. I'm overly judgmental here. The longer the guards were kept busy, the easier it was for Irid and the other energy wielders to strike, one after another. They blasted their adversaries into unconsciousness. The guards' ranks thinned moment by moment until only a handful were left on either side of the yard. Then a steely voice rang out, "This must stop!" It was Osan. As Irid watched, the administrator came out onto the battlements, his hands notably empty of weapons. No doubt he had seen how ineffective such things were against the transformed. I mean, no doubt he would have seen that over the course of the last month as well, I would hope. I mean, obviously the stun guns work on a lot of them so far, but they keep adding new superpower people to the pile here, thinking that's not going to change anything. We need to speak, not fight, Osan cried out. He signaled the guards to stop firing and held his hands out. It looked to Arid as if he were praying. The transformed looked at each other and desisted. As the administrator had asked, the yard grew quiet, though it was decidedly an uneasy quiet. Arid was skeptical. What did Osan think he was going to do? Marshal the forces of sweet reason against these misguided youths wreaking havoc in the prison yard? As it turned out, that was exactly what the man thought. This is insane, he told the transformed. We are not your enemy. We're here to help you, to protect you from the outside world. We've heard that speech, someone called out. If you want to help us, open the gates and let us out. Or is it the outside world you want to protect from us? Yes, that should be very obvious by now. The administrator shook his head. You've got to trust us. Whatever the problem is, we can work it out together. Suddenly, Arid heard his own voice raised as well. You wouldn't let me contact my parents, he shouted. Osan found him and looked at him. Perhaps we can change that policy. Perhaps it wasn't necessary in the first place. Perhaps you're lying through your teeth, someone shouted, his voice echoing dramatically in the yard. I played D&D too. For the 3 fans of the movie Airheads watching or listening. Arid turned and saw Rahatan standing there. Dinara and Layden directly behind him. The Earth Mover pointed a finger at the administrator. You kept us down and deceived us long enough, he shouted. Now it's time for you to reap what you've sown. Rahatan gestured and the walls of the fortress began to tremble, as if caught in the throes of an earthquake. Osan tried to protest, but the words were drowned by the sound of stone grating against stone. Some of the guards were shaken off their perches. Those who managed to stay on their feet tried futilely to take aim at that transformed. But that transformed had no trouble taking aim at them. Arid sent a burst of energy at a guard. I'm sorry, I have to gussy this up a bit because I'm getting really bored with these non-existent characters with no personality. Someone else blasted another one. Then the rest of Osan's men leaped from the battlements, reluctant to get caught in the collapse of the wall. The transformed in the yard were waiting for them. Layden disarmed 2 of the guards and battered them with their own weapons. Dinara enveloped one in her shield and cut his air off. And Sevian sent more of them flying from imaginary pursuers until they collided and knocked each other out. Soon there were no longer any guards on their feet of all the uniformed personnel in the fortress. Only Osan was still conscious, but able to bear witness to the escape. But the parapet beneath him was twisting and cracking. Loose stones were coming loose. Backing up. Large stones were coming loose. That's it. And striking the ground with lethal force, finally with a sound of thunder. And rock and roll. Finally, with the sound of thunder, the wall wavered and caved in on itself, not in one place, but in several at the same time. Osan fell, too. He dropped out of sight into the clouds of dust that billowed in the yard. For several long seconds, Arid choked and gasped for air. Then, as the clouds settled, he spied the administrator lying on a chunk of the ruined wall. But was he alive? Arid hoped so. He hadn't wanted to kill anyone, just win his freedom. Rahatan himself approached Osan, inspected the administrator's face. Then he turned to the other transformed, all of whom seemed to have the same question in their eyes. He's hurt but alive, he announced. Not that he deserves to be after what he did to us. Arid breathed a sigh of relief. But we're not done yet, Rahatan announced, his voice full of urgency. Before the guards regain consciousness, we've got to bind them and place them in what's left of the cells. And those of us who were stunned must be revived. Quickly now. Arid didn't hesitate. Though covered with dust and sweat, he started to help with the binding of one of the guards. Then Dinara came over to him. Rahatan wants to check on Moloch. Arid recalled the name. Paul Duel had mentioned it, and mentioned it the other day. He's insane, the telepath had noted. And dangerous, too. He can set things aflame just by looking at them, so they don't dare let him out into the yard. Yes, as we were told in the previous chapter. We got it. Did someone tell the author this was going to be, like, released in a series of magazine installments or something? It's going to be like a month between chapters that people are going to have to be reminded of this stuff? I demand answers. I demand answers. That was why Rahatan wanted Erid to accompany Dinara, because Malik was too dangerous for one of them. Getting up, he followed Dinara in the direction of the cells. When they got there, he saw that one of the outer walls that had crumbled. Away, the result of Rahatan's efforts. No doubt. Yeah, no doubt. Yes, no doubt. We got it. We know. We were here when the thing happened with the guy that moves the walls, named Rahatan. Woof. Stepping over the rubble, Erid and Dinara went inside and waded through the dust-ridden air. There were barred cells on either side of the long corridor. 3 of the ones on the left displayed ruined masonry and twisted bars. No doubt they had held Rahatan, Dinara, and Laden. The cells on the right, however, seemed perfectly intact despite the tremors to which Rahatan had subjected the entire fortress. If Malik was inside one of those cells, as Dinara had indicated, he might well have gone unscathed. Before Erid could find out one way or the other, he heard a bizarre, croaking sound. It repeated itself over and over. Turning to Dinara, he noticed her lack of surprise. "What is that?" he asked. She grunted. Another grunting person. Have you ever heard someone grunt at you with words? No. No, no. She grunted. "That's the man we're looking for." Then she pointed to the last cell on the right. Erid followed her gesture. There was something about the croaking that made his skin crawl. Nonetheless, Rahatan had given him a job, and he meant to see it through. As he walked the length of the corridor, the croaking grew louder and louder, echoing from wall to wall. Erid took the opportunity to glance to his right and left. All the other barred compartments were empty, he noticed. Only Malik's was occupied. Finally, he came to the cell he was looking for. All at once, the croaking seemed to diminish in intensity, signifying Malik's awareness of him, clenching his jaw. Erid peered inside the compartment. Malik was in there all right, but the fellow was naked, his garments shoved into a corner of the cell as if he had no longer any need of them. His skin was covered with razor-thin black stripes, and there were sacs on either side of his neck that inflated and deflated as he breathed. "Are you all right?" Erid asked him. For a moment, Malik just stared at him. Then he smiled slyly and created a flash of fire in the space between them. Instinctively, Erid flinched. That made the transformed in the cell smile even more. He made another flash and another. "Malik," he said in a reedy voice. Oh, sorry. I went the wrong way. Reedy voice. So, "Malik," he said in a reedy voice. "Malik, Malik." It was the sound Eric had heard before, but now he knew it wasn't just a croak. It was the poor man's name. Yeah, but he knew his name before he heard the sound. How did he not? That was the point. They're going to get Malik. "Malik, Malik," said the prisoner. Erid wanted to free him, but in this case, at least, he had to agree with Osan's approach. It would be better if they left Malik where he was. He turned back to Dinara. "He seems all right, but if we take him with us, he's likely to hurt someone. Himself, maybe." "How do you know? How do you know that?" She nodded. "We'll have to give him some food, though. He may be here for a while before the government finds him." Erid agreed. As he and Dinara went to find sustenance for the only transformed who would be left behind. What a great idea when you're trying to bust out of a place. Like, let's leave the most destructive one here. He vowed never to curse his fate again. Ugly and afflicted as he was still a lot better off than some people. All right. There we go. That was an hour and a half. We are maybe a third of the way through the book at this point. Chapter 10 is next. Thanks for being here, everybody. Hope you're having a nice weekend.